Snow clung in thin white veins along the edges of the arroyo, the last stubborn hold of winter refusing to loosen its grip. The rest of the land lay bare and pale under a hard March sky. Sagebrush the color of old pewter, grass flattened and lifeless from months of frost. The wind had the sharp smell of iron and dust, and somewhere far off, a hinge squeaked on an abandoned barn door. Alma Finch stood in the middle of what the deed called Raven's Rest Ranch, though it looked more like the skeleton of a dream. 3 cabins sat silent and caved in, roofs sagging like broken backs. A well leaned at an angle, its rope long gone. The place had the look of something emptied in a hurry. Not the slow crumble of neglect, but the hollow after a sudden flight. She held the paper in her glove, the ink still smudged where her hand had pressed too hard in signing. $76. She could hardly believe it herself. It was all she had left after selling the last of her late father's tools in Abilene. And yet here she stood, wind cutting through her coat, the deed to a ghost ranch in her pocket. A shutter banged on the farthest cabin. She turned. The sound should have been nothing, just the wind. But the rhythm wasn't right. It wasn't the quick staccato of a loose hinge. It was deliberate. Open. Close. Open. Her boots crunched over frozen dirt as she moved closer. She didn't call out, not yet. That deep, instinctive caution she'd carried since girlhood in Kansas whispered that it was better to see before being seen. The cabin door wasn't all the way shut, and in the dim interior, she caught movement. Not a shadow, a figure. For a moment, her mind told her it was a trick of the light, that ghost stories had wormed their way into her thoughts already. But then the figure shifted, and she saw the outline of a boy, no more than 12, standing stiff as a fence post. His eyes locked on her like a cornered animal's. Behind him, in the deeper dark of the room, was another shape, broader, taller, a man. Alma's breath slowed. This wasn't in the deed. 2 weeks earlier, she'd been sitting in the back of Crawley's General Store in Abilene, listening to old men talk. They always talked too loud, their voices carrying over the clink of bottles and the smell of raw tobacco. Ghost Ranch, one had said, leaning forward as if guarding a treasure. Raven's Rest. Used to be a stage stop for the trouble. What trouble? Another had asked. The old man just shook his head. Folks say Apache took it. Others say fever. Either way, been empty near 10 years. Now the bank can't get rid of it for nothing. $76. Last I heard. Alma had kept her face neutral, but inside, something had sparked. $76 was almost exactly what she had in her satchel. Her father's death had left her untethered, drifting between sewing work and short-term lodging. She was tired of borrowed rooms and people looking at her like she'd overstayed her welcome before she'd even unpacked. The idea of her own land, no matter how worn or lonely, had a pull she couldn't shake. By the next morning, she was on a wagon headed west, deed in hand before sunset. Now, standing in the doorway of the cabin, Alma's thoughts were nothing like they had been in the store. The man stepped forward into a shaft of cold light. His hair was dark and hung loose around a lean, hard face. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed from miles. There was no weapon in sight, but he carried himself like a man who didn't need one close at hand to be dangerous. "You're trespassing," Alma said, her voice even. The man's eyes didn't waver. "This is our home." His voice was low, not unfriendly, but with the firmness of someone who'd had to defend the same thing before. "Not anymore. I bought it." At that, the boy's shoulders tightened. The man's jaw worked, but he didn't move. From deeper in the cabin came a faint cough. A woman's. Alma glanced past him and saw a figure lying on a cot, face turned to the wall, a thin blanket pulled to her chin. Alma's grip on the doorframe eased just slightly. Whoever these people were, they weren't ghosts, and they weren't here for mischief. Not in the middle of a winter barely letting go. "I didn't know anyone was still here," Alma said finally. The man studied her for a long moment before speaking. "We don't take charity. We'll be gone soon." But something in his voice told her that wasn't true. Or maybe it was the way the boy's eyes darted toward the woman on the cot. Like leaving wasn't an option. The wind picked up again, rattling the boards. A storm was brewing out on the horizon, the kind that could turn a day into a night's trap of ice and wind. Alma looked at the man, then at the boy, then back at the woman in the shadows. And in the space of one heartbeat, she felt the decision rising, the one that would change everything before spring came. She didn't make it yet, but she didn't step away from the door either. The man's gaze flicked to her boots, then back to her eyes. "You from town?" "No, good," he said. "Then you don't know the story." Alma didn't answer, but the wind howled against the cabin walls like it wanted in, and she knew one thing for certain. Whatever story this place held, she was standing in the middle of it now, and the snow in the arroyo wasn't the only thing refusing to melt. The storm came in quick, swallowing the horizon in a wall of gray. By sundown, the wind was a live thing, clawing at shutters, hissing through gaps in the chinking. Alma had taken shelter in the smallest of the ranch's cabins, the one nearest the well, but she couldn't stop glancing toward the far cabin where the family stayed. She told herself she should wait out the weather before deciding anything. But the coughing she'd heard earlier kept replaying in her mind, dry and rattling, the kind that meant fever was setting its teeth in. When the wind dipped low enough to walk, she wrapped her coat tight and crossed the yard, boots crunching over a skin of ice. The door opened before she could knock. The boy stood there, hair mussed from sleep, eyes dark with suspicion. "Your pa here?" she asked. His chin lifted, but before he could answer, the man's voice came from inside. "Let her in, Eli." The warmth inside hit her first, not from a stove, but from bodies in close quarters. The woman lay on the cot still, her face turned toward them now. She was young, not much older than Alma herself, but thin to the bone, her skin pale except for the flush across her cheeks. The man knelt beside her, wringing out a cloth and pressing it to her forehead. "She's worse," he said without looking up. Alma stepped closer, feeling the heat radiating off the woman. "She needs broth, water, something in her to keep her strength." The man's jaw tightened. "We've got no supplies. You're miles from town. She won't make that walk." Alma set her bag down. "I've got a few things. Not much, but enough to help for now." The boy's eyes flickered with something. Hope or fear, she couldn't tell. The man looked at her then, long and steady. "We didn't ask for help." "I didn't ask if you did," Alma replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rattled the walls, and the sound of it seemed to hold them in that stillness. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Name's Luke. Alma Finch." She moved to the stove, coaxing the coals back to life, and poured what little she had from her satchel. Dried beans, a scrap of jerky, a handful of cornmeal. It wasn't much, but the smell of cooking seemed to loosen something in the air. Luke watched her work, his shoulders still tense but his hands resting at last. Eli sat on a stool, legs swinging, eyes fixed on the pot as if it were magic. When the food was ready, Alma spooned a thin broth into a tin cup and helped the woman, Luke's wife, she guessed, sit up just enough to drink. The woman's eyes opened briefly, dark and glassy, meeting Alma's with a look that was part gratitude, part warning. That night, Alma meant to go back to her own cabin. But the storm made liars of intentions. The wind screamed like something wild, and Luke told her flatly she'd be safer inside. So she stayed, sitting by the stove while Luke dozed in a chair and Eli curled up on a blanket. Outside, the storm buried the land in white. Inside, the fire's glow flickered over faces still worn from more than just winter. By morning, the wind had quieted, but a different tension had settled. Luke stood at the window staring out at the yard. "What is it?" Alma asked. "Tracks," he said. "Fresh. Too fresh for the storm to have left them uncovered." Alma joined him. In the snow leading up toward the ridge were the clean prints of a single horse. Whoever it was had ridden close, circled, and gone on. Luke's voice was low. "If someone from town saw the smoke last night, they'll talk." Alma frowned. "Talk about what?" He turned to her then, and there was no mistaking the warning in his eyes. "That we're still here. What difference does it make? Out here, difference is everything. Luke said. Some folks think we've got no right to this land. Others think we've got something worth taking. Alma thought of the old men in Crawley's store, of the way they'd lowered their voices when they said trouble. She realized now it wasn't just a ghost story they'd been telling. And she knew, without being told, that keeping this family's presence a secret might mean standing against people she had yet to meet. People who would see her as a fool or worse. But then she looked at Eli, at the way he was carefully breaking the ice from the water bucket for his mother, and the choice felt smaller than it should have. Outside, the snow was already melting under a pale sun. Whatever was coming, it was moving closer. The days after the storm settled into a strange rhythm. Alma kept to her own cabin in the mornings, tending the well, patching a draft along the north wall. By midday she'd find herself in Luke's cabin, helping Eli split kindling or coaxing his wife, Mara, to eat what little she could keep down. Mara spoke in quiet bursts, a word here, a question there, as though each syllable cost her more than she could afford. Alma learned she had been sick since before the snows came, and the illness had worsened when the last of their stores ran out. It should have felt temporary, Alma told herself, just until Mara got her strength back. But the tracks Luke had seen in the snow stayed in the back of her mind, and soon enough, proof came that whoever had passed by hadn't forgotten. It was late afternoon when the first sign arrived. Not a rider, but a sound. Faint, from the north, carrying over the brittle grass. A low metallic jingle. Luke was outside, mending a hinge, when he froze. Alma followed his gaze toward the rise. Two riders appeared, their horses slow but deliberate, eyes on the cabins. Luke stepped inside, grabbed the rifle from the wall, and set it just inside the doorframe. "Don't speak unless I tell you to," he said. The riders came close enough that Alma could see the dust on their coats, the weather-creased lines of their faces. Both wore the look of men who'd spent too much time around trouble. One of them, tall, with a red scarf knotted at his throat, lifted a hand in greeting but didn't smile. "Heard someone took the deed to Raven's Rest," he called. Alma stepped forward before Luke could answer. "I did. Alma Finch." The man's eyes flicked to Luke, then back to her. "Funny. Thought it was abandoned. Guess we were wrong." "You were," Alma said. The second rider leaned on his saddle horn. "Town's been wondering who'd be fool enough to buy this place. Bad history." "History's past," Alma replied. That drew a dry laugh from the one in the scarf. "Not out here, it ain't." His eyes slid toward Luke again, and there was weight in the look, the kind of weight that came with old grudges. Luke didn't move. "You've had your look. Now you can ride on." The man didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted toward the cabin door, toward the thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. "You're not alone here," he said finally. Something cold threaded through Alma's chest. "That's none of your business." The scarfed rider smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Everything out here's somebody's business." He reined his horse around. "We'll be seeing you." They rode off slow, not looking back. When they were gone, Alma turned to Luke. "Who were they?" "Trouble," Luke said flatly. "From town. From everywhere." That night, Alma lay awake in her own cabin, the fire burning low. She could still see the way the scarfed man had looked at Luke. Not curious, not cautious, but like he was measuring something. In the stillness, Mara's cough carried faintly across the yard. Alma thought of how easily the riders had guessed she wasn't alone, and how quickly word could travel in a land this empty. By morning, the unease had settled into her bones. She walked to Luke's cabin with a bundle of firewood and found him already awake, packing their few belongings into a crate. "You're leaving?" she asked. He shook his head. "Preparing, in case we have to." Eli looked up from where he was oiling a lantern. "Do we have to?" Luke's voice was quiet but firm. "Not yet." Alma glanced between them. Father, son, wife too weak to stand, and knew that "not yet" was just another way of saying the time would come. And when it did, she wasn't sure whose side she'd be standing on, hers or theirs. But she knew one thing. Those riders weren't the kind to let go of a place or a grudge without a fight. And they weren't going to wait long to come back. By the third morning, the wind had changed. It carried a stillness Alma recognized from her years on the prairie, that heavy, waiting quiet before something broke. Even the crows had gone silent, their usual ragged calls absent from the frost-bitten cottonwoods. Luke noticed it too. He was out by the corral, running a hand along the rail as if testing its strength, when he stopped mid-step. His gaze shifted to the far ridge. Alma followed it. At first, she saw nothing but the pale sweep of land and the low sun catching on patches of old snow. Then a flicker movement along the ridge's edge. Horsemen. Not two this time, but more. 5, 6, maybe more hidden in the folds of the land. They're here, Luke said. Alma's chest tightened. You're sure it's them? Luke gave her a look that said she didn't need to ask. Scarf'll be leading him. He went back inside, speaking low to Eli while Alma stood in the doorway. The riders moved slow, deliberate, not like men looking to pass through, but like they wanted to be seen coming. The first sound to reach them was the rhythmic thud of hooves on frozen earth, carrying in the still air like a drumbeat. Then the faint creak of saddle leather, the jangle of tack. It was steady, patient, and far too calm to be anything but a message. We have time and we'll take all we need of it. Luke stepped out with the rifle slung loose in his hands. He didn't raise it, not yet. Inside, he told Alma. I'm not hiding, she said. This isn't your fight. I bought this land, she shot back. If it's not my fight, whose is it? Luke's eyes met hers for a moment, and something passed between them. Not agreement, but recognition. She wasn't going to move. The riders reached the open stretch before the yard and stopped. The scarfed man was there, just as Luke had said, sitting easy in the saddle like he was on a porch swing. He scanned the cabins, the corral, the yard, all of it slow, deliberate. You weren't alone, he said, his voice carrying clear in the stillness. Just like I thought. Luke said nothing. The scarfed man's gaze shifted to Alma. Ma'am, you bought this place. Means you should know what comes with it. Old debts. Old claims. Alma kept her voice steady. Whatever happened here before isn't my concern. That's where you're wrong, the man said. Everything here's your concern now, including who you let live on your land. Behind him, one of the other riders chuckled low. Luke's jaw flexed, but he stayed silent. Alma realized he was holding himself in check, like a man who knew too well how quickly words could tip a day into blood. The scarfed man leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Last offer, send him off before nightfall. Or we come back, and no one sleeps easy. No one moved. The wind stirred faintly, carrying the smell of wood smoke from Mara's cabin. Then the man tugged his reins, turning slow. Nightfall, he said over his shoulder, and the riders pulled away, not fast, not slow. Just enough to make it clear they'd be back when they chose. When the sound of hoofbeats finally faded, Alma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They're not bluffing, Luke said quietly. I know. He looked toward the ridge, where the last rider had just disappeared from view. Then you know we've got a choice. Run, or be ready to stand. Alma's eyes drifted to the small cabin where Mara lay sick and Eli kept watch. Running meant dragging them through cold and distance they might not survive. Staying meant facing men who didn't care what the deed in her pocket said. It was the kind of choice she'd hoped she'd never have to make. And it had to be made before the sun touched the horizon. The sun slid lower, turning the snow patches on the ridge into molten gold. Luke had said nightfall, and now the line between daylight and dark was bleeding fast. Inside the cabin, Mara was propped against a pillow, Eli sitting close enough to feel her breath. Alma moved between the stove and the table, her hands steady even though her chest felt tight as a cinched saddle. They'll come, Luke said from the window. Then let's make sure there's nothing here worth taking, Alma replied. She set a pot of water to boil and began packing the few sacks of food into a trunk. Not to hide them, but to keep busy, the way her father used to before storms he couldn't stop. Luke watched her for a moment, then turned to Eli. If anything happens, you take your ma to Alma's cabin. Bar the door. Eli swallowed hard, nodded. When the knock came, it wasn't the pounding of men set on forcing their way in. It was slow, deliberate. Luke opened the door, rifle in hand but pointed to the floor. The scarfed man stood there alone. Behind him, the rest of the riders waited out in the yard, horses shifting in the cold. "You stayed," the man said. "We did," Luke answered. The scarfed man's gaze slid past him to Alma. "You could have avoided this. Folks in town would have called you smart for it." Alma stepped forward until she was shoulder to shoulder with Luke. "I'm not sending them off. If this land is mine, so is the choice of who lives on it." Something flickered in the man's eyes, surprise, maybe, or respect. "You know what people say happened here?" he asked her. "I've heard enough to know it's more rumor than truth," Alma said. The scarfed man's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Truth is, my brother died here, 10 years back. Some blamed Luke's people, some blamed mine, but no one ever proved a thing. We just left the place to rot." Luke's voice was low but steady. "I never touched your brother." The man studied him a long moment, then glanced at Mara, pale but watching from her cot. "And she's the reason you stayed." Luke didn't answer. He didn't have to. The scarfed man looked back at Alma. "You've got grit, I'll give you that. Grit's worth something out here. More than paper deeds or old grudges." He stepped back from the door. "Keep your land. Keep your people. But don't think you've made friends today." Alma's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "I don't need friends who'd take a sick woman from her bed." For a heartbeat, the yard was so still the only sound was the horse's breathing. Then the scarfed man swung into his saddle, turned his horse toward the ridge. The others followed without a word. The sound of their departure faded into the cold, open air. Luke set the rifle down, exhaling slow. "You may have just saved us." Alma shook her head. "We saved each other." That night, the cabins glowed with firelight. Mara's color returned bit by bit, and Eli slept curled by the hearth. Alma sat at the table, staring into the flames, the deed heavy in her pocket. Raven's Rest was no longer a ghost ranch. It had voices again, warmth again. And for the first time since she'd signed her name, Alma knew she hadn't bought a ruin. She'd claimed a home. Out beyond the ridge, the wind rose, but it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like the land breathing. Alma stepped forward until she was shoulder to shoulder with Luke. "I'm not sending them off. If this land is mine, so is the choice of who lives on it." Something flickered in the man's eyes, surprise, maybe, or respect. "You know what people say happened here?" he asked her. "I've heard enough to know it's more rumor than truth," Alma said. The scarfed man's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Truth is, my brother died here, 10 years back. Some blamed Luke's people, some blamed mine, but no one ever proved a thing. We just left the place to rot." Luke's voice was low but steady. "I never touched your brother." The man studied him a long moment, then glanced at Mara, pale but watching from her cot. "And she's the reason you stayed." Luke didn't answer. He didn't have to. The scarfed man looked back at Alma. "You've got grit, I'll give you that. Grit's worth something out here. More than paper deeds or old grudges." He stepped back from the door. "Keep your land. Keep your people. But don't think you've made friends today." Alma's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "I don't need friends who'd take a sick woman from her bed." For a heartbeat, the yard was so still the only sound was the horse's breathing. Then the scarfed man swung into his saddle, turned his horse toward the ridge. The others followed without a word. The sound of their departure faded into the cold, open air. Luke set the rifle down, exhaling slow. "You may have just saved us." Alma shook her head. "We saved each other." That night, the cabins glowed with firelight. Mara's color returned bit by bit, and Eli slept curled by the hearth. Alma sat at the table, staring into the flames, the deed heavy in her pocket. Raven's Rest was no longer a ghost ranch. It had voices again, warmth again. And for the first time since she'd signed her name, Alma knew she hadn't bought a ruin. She'd claimed a home. Out beyond the ridge, the wind rose, but it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like the land breathing.